In episode 86, titled Threat Modeling for Hybrid Networks, How the Exam Frames Risk, the aim is to make threat modeling feel like structured, practical thinking about likely attacks rather than an abstract security ritual. Hybrid networks are messy by nature because they connect on-premises systems, cloud services, and remote users through multiple trust relationships, and that is exactly where risk hides in plain sight. The exam tends to reward clear reasoning over fancy terminology, so you want a method that helps you explain what could go wrong and why it matters. Threat modeling gives you that method by forcing you to think in a repeatable way about what you are protecting, who might attack it, how they might get in, and what damage could follow. Before we continue, a quick note: this audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with plain terms that keep you grounded, because threat modeling collapses when people drift into vague language that cannot guide decisions. Assets are what you care about, like credentials, sensitive data, critical services, and control planes, and you should be able to describe them without hiding behind tool names. Actors are who might cause harm, including external attackers, opportunistic scanners, malicious insiders, and careless insiders, because intent and capability shape what is likely. Entry points are where those actors can touch the system, like public endpoints, remote access gateways, application programming interfaces, and identity flows, because exposure is what makes an asset reachable. Impacts are the kinds of harm that follow, such as data loss, fraud, downtime, lateral movement, and reputational damage. And impact is what ties security work to business reality. Once you can name assets, actors, entry points, and impacts, the next step is to map trust boundaries and data flows, because that is how you locate exposures without guessing. A trust boundary is where assumptions change, such as when traffic crosses from the internet into a demilitarized zone, from a remote user into a corporate network, or from one cloud account into another. Data flows are the paths data takes between components, including authentication requests, application calls, and administrative control traffic, and they matter because each hop can introduce a new failure mode. When you draw boundaries and flows, you stop thinking of the system as a blob and start seeing it as transitions, and transitions are where identity, encryption, and authorization can break down. The exam framing often expects you to recognize that a boundary is not just a firewall line, but any point where trust, ownership, or control changes. Hybrid environments have a few common risk clusters that show up repeatedly, and you should be able to recognize them quickly because they are more testable than rare edge cases. Internet edges are a constant focus because anything exposed publicly becomes a candidate for scanning, exploitation, and denial of service, even when the service is not famous. Identity providers, spelled out as identity providers, are high-value targets because they sit at the center of authentication and authorization. So failures there can cascade into widespread access loss or widespread unauthorized access. Application programming interfaces, often shortened to APIs after first mention, create risk because they are designed to be consumed programmatically, and that makes them attractive for abuse, credential stuffing, and token replay when controls are weak. In a hybrid design, these risks compound because the internet edge can feed identity flows can mint access to APIs, and APIs can become the path into internal services. A key exam-friendly skill is to treat likelihood versus impact as a simple prioritization tool, because you will always find more potential threats than you can address at once. Likelihood asks how probable the threat is given the exposure, the actor's capability, and the environment's history, and you can usually reason about it without needing perfect data. Impact asks what happens if the threat succeeds, including confidentiality, integrity, and availability consequences. And impact should be stated in the language of service disruption and business loss rather than vague fear. When you combine likelihood and impact, you get a practical ranking that favors common and damaging problems over rare and dramatic ones. This is not about predicting the future with certainty, but about making your next control investment defensible and aligned to what is most likely to hurt you. Now put that method into motion with a scenario that the exam likes because it touches identity, networking, and operational reality in one path, a remote access flow into a hybrid network. The remote access path often begins with a user device on an untrusted network, passes through a virtual private network, spelled out as virtual private network, or a zero-trust gateway, and then reaches internal services that may live partly on-premises and partly in the cloud. When you model the flow, you identify assets like credentials and tokens, entry points like the gateway and authentication endpoints, and boundaries like the jump from internet to gateway and from gateway to internal network segments. The weak link is rarely the tunnel encryption itself, but rather authentication strength, device posture validation, overly broad network access after connection, or poorly monitored privileged sessions. This scenario is useful because it reveals that the risk often sits in what happens after access is granted, not only in how access is requested. As you examine that remote access model, look for the kinds of failure chains that produce real incidents, because hybrid compromises often follow a predictable rhythm. A phishing attack can capture credentials, then an attacker uses those credentials to authenticate against the identity provider, and then they exploit permissive access rules to reach internal systems. If multi-factor authentication is weak or inconsistently enforced, the likelihood rises sharply because credential theft is common and automation makes testing stolen credentials cheap. If network segmentation is shallow, the impact rises because initial access can turn into lateral movement across services and accounts. A threat model that highlights the weakest link lets you propose a small number of high-leverage controls, like stronger authentication, tighter authorization scopes, and better monitoring of session behavior, instead of spreading effort across dozens of low-value tasks. A major pitfall is focusing on exotic threats while missing common misconfigurations, because the exam tends to emphasize what fails most often in real organizations. Exotic threats can be interesting, but they are often low likelihood compared to misconfigured access rules, exposed management ports, overly permissive security groups, weak token lifetimes, or missing input validation on APIs. When teams fixate on rare attack techniques, they may ignore the simple exposures that automated scanners exploit every day, and those simple exposures produce the majority of preventable incidents. A threat model should start with the obvious entry points and the most common attacker paths, because boring threats are frequently the ones that succeed. If your model cannot explain how a misconfiguration leads to compromise, it is probably not helping you prioritize effectively. Another pitfall is ignoring insider risk and privileged access pathways, because insiders have proximity and context that external attackers must work hard to obtain. Insider risk is not only malicious intent, but also mistakes, like an administrator applying a change in the wrong account or granting access to the wrong group. Privileged access pathways include administrative consoles, bastion hosts, automation credentials, service accounts, and break glass procedures, and these pathways often bypass the controls that protect normal user flows. In hybrid networks, privileged pathways can bridge environments, so a single compromised administrative identity might grant access to both cloud control planes and on-premises management networks. The exam expects you to recognize that privileged access deserves special attention because it increases both likelihood of misuse and impact of success, even when the architecture looks segmented for normal traffic. A practical quick win is to start with crown jewels and the biggest entry points, because that keeps threat modeling from becoming a never-ending brainstorming session. Crown jewels are the assets whose compromise would cause disproportionate harm, like identity systems, sensitive datasets, payment workflows, and core network control planes. Biggest entry points are the exposures most likely to be touched by attackers, such as internet-facing services, remote access gateways, and externally reachable APIs, because exposure drives opportunity. When you start there, you can build a small set of high-confidence threats and then expand outward only as needed, which matches the exam's preference for clear prioritization. This approach also creates a natural stopping point, because once crown jewels and major entry points are covered with credible controls, the remaining threats often fall into lower priority tiers. Threat modeling is not an academic exercise, so an operationally sound step is translating findings into controls and monitoring needs, because that is how the model becomes useful in day-to-day defense. Controls are the preventative and detective measures that reduce likelihood or reduce impact, such as stronger authentication, tighter authorization boundaries, segmentation, rate limiting, and secure defaults for APIs. Monitoring needs are the signals that tell you whether controls are working and whether an attack is unfolding, such as unusual authentication failures, impossible travel patterns, token misuse indicators, and abnormal east-west traffic after remote access. In a hybrid environment, the translation should include where telemetry is collected and who responds, because a control that cannot be observed and acted upon is fragile. The exam often frames this as connecting risk identification to actionable mitigation, which is exactly the discipline you want in real operations. A memory anchor that keeps your thinking structured is assets, boundaries, entry, impact, controls, because it mirrors how you build a model without getting lost. Assets forces you to name what matters. Boundaries forces you to locate where trust changes, and entry forces you to identify where actors can touch the system. Impact keeps the discussion tied to what harm looks like, and controls keeps you honest about what you will actually do about the risk. When you can walk through this anchor smoothly, you can explain your reasoning in a way that sounds calm and technical, which is valuable both for the exam and for professional decision-making. The anchor also helps you avoid the two extremes of threat modeling, where one side is endless speculation and the other side is a superficial checklist. With this structure, you can be thorough without being sprawling. A useful prompt-style exercise is to name 3 threats for a described architecture, because it trains you to pick representative risks rather than chasing every possibility. Imagine an architecture with remote users accessing internal applications through a virtual private network gateway, with authentication handled by a centralized identity provider, and application traffic routed through an API gateway to services in both cloud and on-premises environments. In that setup, you can reasonably identify credential theft leading to unauthorized access, misconfigured authorization allowing excessive access after authentication, and API abuse leading to data exposure or service disruption. The point is not to list every threat, but to choose 3 that map cleanly to assets, boundaries, entry points, and impacts, and that reflect what actually happens in hybrid incidents. Practicing this builds speed and clarity, which is exactly what exam questions tend to measure. To reinforce speed and clarity, add a recap habit where you link each threat to a mitigation quickly, because threat statements without mitigation are incomplete, and mitigation without threat is unfocused. If the threat is credential theft against an identity provider, the mitigation might be strong multi-factor authentication, phishing-resistant methods where feasible, and monitoring for anomalous logins, because those reduce likelihood and improve detection. If the threat is overly broad access after authentication, the mitigation might be least privilege authorization, segmented network access, and conditional access policies, because those reduce blast radius and reduce privilege escalation paths. If the threat is API abuse, the mitigation might be rate limiting, strong authentication and authorization at the API layer, input validation, and monitoring for unusual request patterns, because those reduce both exploitation and denial of service risk. This quick linking is an exam-friendly way to show you understand not just what could happen, but how defenses map to the risk. Episode 86 closes with the idea that threat modeling for hybrid networks is a repeatable process of walking boundaries, following data flows, and prioritizing what is likely and damaging rather than what is merely interesting. You name assets and actors, identify entry points, map trust boundaries, and then use likelihood versus impact to decide what matters first, which keeps the work grounded. You avoid the traps of exotic obsession and insider neglect by focusing on misconfigurations, privileged pathways, and the control plane elements that attackers actually target. The rehearsal assignment is a boundary walk, where you take one hybrid flow, such as remote access to an internal service, and narrate, step by step, where trust changes and what exposures appear at each transition. When you can do that smoothly, you are demonstrating the exact kind of structured risk thinking the exam is looking for, and you are building an operational skill that pays off long after the test is over. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.